Andrew, man, thank you so much for coming back on the show. Really excited to have you on. Could you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on again. So big fan of the podcast, and I'm always willing to hop on whenever you reach out. So I appreciate you reaching out. Yeah, my name's Andrew Paul. I'm currently the director of performance and rehab for the Oklahoma City Thunder. This is my 10th year.
Wow.
This is my 10th year in the NBA, which I think we talked back in 2018.
Yes, I had to go back and look. 2018, man.
Yeah, I was I think I was a third year in the league, and it doesn't seem that long ago because time goes fast. But now, yeah, going on year 10. Before this, I mean, I've been kind of around several different settings. I was at Exos Performance Center in Florida for a few years. So I did the private sector. I was at University of Missouri on a staff and a football staff there for about 7 years. Prior to that, so I did the college thing. I worked in high school for a little bit previously to that. So professionally, I felt like I was very happy that I've experienced a lot of different things, and I'm really happy with where I'm at. But I feel like I've experienced a lot of different settings, and that's really helped me form kind of the coach I am personally. I'm married. I've been married for 12 years. Since the last time we've talked, I have a 2.5-year-old girl. She's beautiful and she's very nice and kind. So I'm very happy with her. And that's what takes up most of my free time now is hanging with my daughter, just having a good time with her and watching her get big. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
I love it, man. I love it. And what else is new, man? Again, I had to go back and search because I was like, I know I've had you on. Yeah. And we saw each other obviously at Summer League this year. So I was like, how long has it been? And I couldn't believe it's been 2018. So
it doesn't seem that long ago.
It doesn't.
Yeah, I remember.
It doesn't, but maybe we're just getting older. Maybe that's part of it too. Like the whole time speeding up thing is happening to us.
Well, it was funny because I remember preparing for that podcast. And at the time, I didn't think I would have much to offer because I felt like I was still trying to figure my job out. I was like, I was after my second year going into my third year. And I'm like, I don't know if I can be of value to anyone based on what I'm doing right now. So I think since then, my role is not much different. I've aged a little bit more. I've learned the NBA a little bit more. The organization I work within has gone through a roller coaster of seasons and phases of the organization, which has been interesting to see. And I'm very fortunate to be part of that. Aside from just being a few years older and experiencing the different phases of life and phases of seasons and things of that nature, I think most things are the same.
Yeah.
So
just it feels a little bit like Groundhog's Day. I feel like unless I think you and I are wired in a similar fashion where we just keep asking why and we just keep digging deeper. And we were joking around before the show because I feel like I've spent the entire day with you because like you prepared for the last podcast, I prepared for this one, right? And you were talking about the series of shows that you did with Joel Smith on his podcast, which I'm going to link to them in the show notes. So if you want to go back and listen to those, they're fantastic, by the way, like really good stuff. It's got me thinking about things. But what I would like to do is kind of start with some of the frameworks that you talked about in Joel's shows. So give us like a jumping off point here. And then I really want to dive into some of the nuance, like some things that you made me think about and just ways that you're applying this in the NBA setting. So let's start really broad and then we'll kind of work our way in. Everybody is differentiating or bucketing their athletes, right? So like Bill's got wide and narrow ISAs. Some people would describe them as muscular versus elastic. But I know you have a specific way that you classify your athletes. So I would love to hear how you classify it and maybe some ways that the people that are listening could, take your principles and then apply it to their people.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is when it comes to classifying athletes, I work with 18 athletes max on a roster, and I have other coaches that work with them too. So I'm functionally working with just a handful of people at any given moment, which allows me to not have to classify them as much in the training. So I've kind of looked at them as an N of one, because I'm not dealing with things at scale, which is a really important concept. I've had to deal with that in college, which requires a little bit more archetyping, labeling, and classifying. So that's one. When I'm talking about archetypes, I'm classifying people to help me make sense of the world around me.
Yes.
Related on shows more so than I am training them in a very specific sequenced way or grouped classifications of training. So like for me, when I speak on those things, it's less about, group A is doing this in the weight room versus group B. I try to view our athletes as an individual because I just can, and it's a function of where I'm at. But for me, it's like, I think everyone's trying to find some version of truth in classifying people and finding patterns and movement styles and training styles helps me make sense of the world around me. And I was talking to an assistant today, and I was like, it's not even about finding like truth. I think everyone for the most part is wrong all the time. And it's like over time, I'm going to try to be less wrong than I was before. And helping learn these patterns hopefully makes me become less wrong over time. So none of the ideas of classification are like unique to me for sure. You just mentioned Bill, muscular and elastic concepts. Joel has a book on it that predates me being on his podcast. And then, Altus has been classifying as mechanical and fascial movers for a long period of time. I think the interesting thing to me was that, Bill has come to talk to our staff before as well. And one of the things I share with him is I like to find what is universal about what everyone is saying. In other words, what are people saying that they're saying the same thing as someone else, they're just using different words.
Yes.
Or a different lens by which they're seeing it through.
Yes.
And I think that's what's happening with those two concepts kind of universally is a lot of people are seeing that. They're saying it in different ways, but they're trying to express similar thoughts. And so they're not really unique to me. I think the way in which I identify or characterize people as being muscular or elastic might be to some degree unique to us. I talk about the movement styles they have on the court and how they manifest those things. There is certainly not one single assessment that I think you can do that will tell you what this person is or isn't.
Sure.
And so when I spoke with Joel, I have subsets of muscular and I have subsets of elastic athletes. And the whole was, 2 podcasts long, so I'll be very brief in describing what those mean. But to me, once you classify someone as being muscular, you can now break him down into be like, there's varieties of muscular. It's not all like just two people. We had very stiff muscular athletes who, for lack of better words, were characterized by less counter movement depth in their vertical jump. They're using really stiff strategies to move, but at the same time, they're really midfoot oriented all the time. They're high force producers, and they're good at some tasks, and they're not so good at other tasks. And we certainly have players like that. You have really pure muscular movers these are your more powerlifter type. That when you ask them to jump, they're going to show you a really deep and slow counter movement, and then really use a concentric impulse to drive their way out of the bottom. They're really midfoot oriented as well, so that. There's certain tasks that they excel at, and there's certain tasks that they're going to have a hard time with, and that's some version of the muscular movers. And then the elastics that I spoke to him about were, I would call them rear foot and forefoot dominant elastic movers.
Yeah,
where those come from to me, and this is Bill Hartman world. So is the gait cycle, and you have these rear foot people that are kind of in an early, and his words would be like early propulsion.
Yep.
I'm not an expert in what he talks about, not nearly as much as other people. So I kind of put my own slang on it. And it's like, these are people that are typically really comfortable in early stance. Their bodies typically, their center of mass is behind their base of support. They tend to have wild ranges of motion in rotation, specifically around their hips. And that's because of orientation. This is a low force producing position, and because of that, they're usually not like wildly. They don't excel in the weight room environment, but they excel at a lot of other things. And one of them is putting on the brakes fast, and we have a lot of those in basketball. but because they have so much rotation, they tend to use those spirals a lot, and that's a characteristic of these people. And you can call them fascial, you can call them, elastic, you can whatever. But that's how I see them. And then the flip side would be the people that are on the other extreme of gait, which are kind of in toe off at all times. And these are people that I call them forefoot elastics.
Yep.
These are people that are really good at projecting their body forwards. They sometimes struggle putting on the brakes. They tend to accrue a lot of tone in their plantar fascia up their posterior chain. Their center of mass is typically out in front of them a lot. And they really excel at getting downhill quickly. And they might struggle elsewhere. And so that's how I've learned to make sense of my thoughts and seeing patterns of people, watching what they're good at, watching what they struggle with, and then trying to match training methods that either maybe work on weaknesses of theirs or maximize their strengths in some way, shape, or form. So that's 4 types of people that I've talked about.
Yeah.
Like I said, when I work with players, I try to view them as individual, and they all come with their own unique backgrounds and histories and values. And I try to incorporate all those things in their training. But when I'm trying to categorize my thoughts and speak them out, I think I sound insane, but that's how I try to do it.
No, I love it. I love it. And when you were talking about that, I think anytime somebody has like some good thoughts and you're starting to like piece some of these examples together, you're immediately trying to think of examples that you have in your weight room, right? Or that you have on your team. And so I have a guy that I've trained for years. His name's Ed Sumner. And man, you talk about a rear foot elastic, right? Because this guy, he looks like just a rubber band, right? Like if you could put a rubber band on a human frame, this is him. And there's highlights of him, not just this last year, but, even back to college, where this guy's got that big penultimate, right? He hits that heel, and then he is going vertical, and he's going up fast.
Yeah.
Right? And so I immediately think of athletes like that. And then, in Joel's podcast, which, listen, you may not even have to go listen to that, because that was a great summary, by the way. Like, you really condensed it down there. So that was a great summary. But then you talk about somebody that's 4 foot elastic, like LeBron James, right? Mm-hmm. And you think about, I think the example you actually used is that, like, if you think about him, like, if he gets a couple steps and he gets downhill, dude, he's coming, he's catching bodies, right? But if you think about just like a one-step gather, it's a lot harder for him, right, to just go purely vertical, and that's, partly archetype, part of it structural. But I think when you start to have these ideas and these representations, it gives you a little bit of insight as to, okay, what is this person going to be good at, and what do we maybe need to focus on or shy away from when we're getting them in the weight room?
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that a lot of this is my 19th year coaching. It's hard to believe I'm coming up on 20 years of being in the industry some way, shape, or form. And I think every year I learn a lot about where I was wrong, where I can nudge a thought in maybe a less wrong direction.
Yes.
And one of the things I remember very early on was that I was a international competitive Olympic lifter growing up. And that when you're a young coach, a majority of what you're drawing from is your own training experience.
Absolutely.
And so I remember thinking like, and that I really improved from those lifts. And I had a great high school coach, one of the best. I mean, he's like a father figure to me to this day. And like I gained a lot of confidence about myself in the weight room from doing those lifts. And so what happened was I would try to do the same kind of programming for athletes I would work with. And you start quickly realizing that, like, one, it doesn't work for everyone. It's like very good.
Yeah.
Two, some of the players, some of the players that like really excel on the field have a very difficult time performing some of those things. And I just, everyone knows that goal. Like, that's one of the first things you'll learn as a coach is like some of your best athletes when it comes to traditional weight room movements are not. But the other thing that happened to me was I started realizing all the I guess the weaknesses in my own athleticism and how they would manifest themselves in the weight room. And despite the fact that I could really excel at some things, I really had a hard time with others. Mm-hmm. And that was my first experience of like trying to trying to figure out what direction I want to go with what I want to do and how I want to do it. And just really trying to observe athletes in an unbiased manner to recognize what their gifts were and where they might struggle and where these and why these trade-offs are happening. And so that's kind of the origin stories of some of these thoughts. And they've kind of grown year after year over the course of 19 years. And so now you're talking about different, forefoots and rear foots and midfoots and stiffness.
Right.
But that's kind of the origin stories of just trying to make sense of the world around me and do the best job I could. So that's where it comes from.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the most important things to do as a young coach is to identify your biases and how they're going to hold you back. I was the same way, right? Like I was the guy, grew up playing basketball, never a great 1 foot jumper. So over time started playing more volleyball and I got into the weight room.
Yeah.
Well, and you've seen me move. So lo and behold, my 2 foot jumping got better, right? Because I was lifting things on 2 legs and I was repeatedly jumping off 2 legs. So, wow, I got better doing that. Everybody should do that.
Yeah.
And you try that for a while and you realize, oh, wow, well, not everybody's like you and not everybody benefits from the same thing. So I think the sooner you can, as a coach, identify your biases, recognize them, see where they're maybe impacting in a negative way your programming, the faster you can get to the really good stuff and realize, hey, if I have people that move like me and that are shaped like me, stuff that works for me will probably work for them. But if I have different contrasting body shapes or movement styles, like this is, like you alluded to, it's not just like a one-size-fits-all approach. It's N equals 1. And everybody's a case study. And you have to figure out what works best for the person standing in front of you.
Yeah, Matt. Well, I think on top of that, one of the things I really value that I think pours into the way I think about things is I really value for any player or client like autonomy and listening and it's just not trying to convince them to like something that I like, but really listening to what they gravitate towards. I have an inherent belief that most people will gravitate towards things that benefit them in the long run if you give them enough time.
Yes.
And so when you notice that certain styles of movers or certain personalities gravitate towards certain exercises, gravitate away from certain things, then like that helps me form a non-judgmental opinion on there must be a reason for that.
Yes.
Like there's no way when a player makes it to the NBA that they don't want to do something that's going to make them more money. So or make them better at basketball or whatever their motivator is. So when someone's adamantly opposed to doing something, or someone's like really enjoying doing something else, like it's information for me to operate off of and allows me to kind of, program towards autonomy a little bit for them. And then also make sense of it in my own mind as to, why might they like that? Why might they not like that? And that's where some of those ideas come from too.
I love it. So another concept I want to talk about, because I think a lot of people, you'll hear, again, different terminology, right? And first off, just to backtrack, you're absolutely right. Like, I think the longer you do this and the more smart people you talk to, everybody's kind of talking about a lot of the same things, but they've all got a little bit different lens or a little bit different terminology. So here's another example, right? Some people will talk about training in athletes' strengths or their weaknesses. Some people will talk about superpowers and kryptonite. You hear about those terms. One of the ways you describe this is the concept of training into versus training away. Yep. So could you talk about the differences between those two? What does it mean to train into something and what does it mean to train away from something?
Yeah, well, I think the fundamental thing is that when you training in refers to using tools in the weight room that are going to magnify someone's strength, something they're naturally good at. One thing I've also learned about that is people can handle much higher volumes of things they're good at than things they're not good at. And an example is, I can handle a lot of load and volume of heavy deadlifting. Mm-hmm. If I took some of specifically our 4 foot elastic athletes who are typically not big force producers and tried to do max effort deadlifts with them twice a week, the likelihood I would cause some serious issues is pretty high. So when you train in, you're leaning into something they already are. And that allows big, strong guys to like doing big, strong things. It allows very flexible people to do a lot of yoga. It allows very fast people to run a lot of sprints. And I think people naturally want to live there. And that's a big part of our training philosophy is recognize the strength of what your strength is, and then utilize training that you're probably not going to have that much of an adverse response to. Training away would be the opposite. If you took someone like myself, who's not an Olympic lifter, heavy, in our words, muscular mover, probably a pure muscular mover, and did a lot of short elastic plyos, heavy volumes of that, I'll have intensities, there's going to be some ramifications to pay for that. And so just having a recognition that, when you do something to train away, you're inherently trying to give them, try to balance the system a little bit, but you really have to do it in a much more cautious, conservative manner. Because if you feed something in that the body's not accustomed to or doesn't like, there's going to be an adverse response there. And sure. That's kind of the genesis of it. I think people have asked me based on that concept, when do you do what? And it's like, to me, I think you're probably doing some of that all the time on both ends. Yeah. And that's a matter of who you're dealing with, why you're doing it. There are some people that are so, in my opinion, so one-sided, elastic or muscular that it becomes a risk factor for them just being there. And so feeding into that may not be a good choice at that moment.
Right.
I think that's the general concept. It's no different than I like to put pretty words around it, but it's no different than like profiling a player and finding gaps in their athletic profile and like trying to build out the weaknesses and magnify the strength. So not a different concept. For me, it's like where, when, how, and what volumes and intensities are you using, because they're going to be different whether you're training in and training away. A good example of when it's probably required to train away is, you have a very elastic individual with heavy tendinopathy history. You're probably dealing with someone who might be a little one-sided and needs a little force production in their life. Sure. And you have to do that in a very sensitive, cautious manner, because if you feed into more elasticity, you might be creating a problem you don't want to handle. Another example might be a power lifter whose hip capsules have locked down to the point where they might need hip surgery. Not that you would start plyometrics with them right away, but you would want to pull away from the heavy force production that's causing that the joint action. And that would be someone you want to train away with, knowing that you're going to have to watch your volumes and loads of things like that. It's like, it's all a matter of the individual, the time, the year, and what you're trying to get done. But that's the general concept.
Yeah. And would you say that just in general, like the early off season is the ideal time to start with training away? Just trying to fill in some of those gaps, or, maybe fill in some of those buckets that have gone unkept for a little while?
Yeah. That's hard to say, man, because I deal with a very specific population. I recognize that. By the time players make it to the NBA, it's like if I worked in the NFL, I would be dealing with a very specific kind of athlete.
Sure.
Muscular athletes are really well suited for collision situations for a number of reasons. And by the time they make it to that level, I'm dealing with someone very specific. So most of our players that I deal with fall into a category of when we're early off season, it's going to become very slow tempo, mostly propulsive type of movements naturally for almost everyone.
Yes.
I think when the big differentiator in all this is when it comes time to perform, what are you going to help either prime them or maximize them for specific periods of the year where you want to peak, and what are you going to take away? And that's where I think the biggest difference is if I'm really worried about an adverse response to training in January before All-Star break or into the playoffs, that's when I'm really going to pull back on anything that I consider to be training away. And I'm probably going to enter some version of training in just to help their body feel just to help them feel primed, I guess might be the right
Yeah,
word.
sure.
But I'm more looking for training that's going to have much more of an acute response, and that's usually training in. So I think that's where the big difference maker is what you're using. We've had players that like to deadlift before games. We've had players like to do jumps and hops and all sorts of things before games, and agility. Like it's all over the map. That's where I think the big difference maker is. But generally, like for me, it's like early off season. Most people are going to fall into a category of slower tempo eccentrics, isometric holds. Now, what movements I choose to do that with might be more specific to the individual, but
Sure.
that's generally how we do things.
Okay. So this is great because this actually leads into the next couple questions I have. And I have thoughts on this, but I want to hear yours because at least what I see, or at least what I feel, is that, if I get a guy that's been through a pretty good high school strength and conditioning and definitely into a collegiate strength and conditioning environment, by the time they're a pro, I don't know how much pure strength or force development they need at that point. But I would love to hear your thoughts on this because I feel like we've already primed that pump and maybe maxed out what we need to get out of that. But I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Like, how much force and strength development do you feel like your guys need?
But my short answer is not as much as you think. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is that the athletes that I'm working with are exceptional and they don't need as much volume of things that most people do. That's the second thing is there's always a risk reward ratio going on, and that's kind of obvious when you say it. I have an opinion on this that is not popular either.
No, let's go. I want to hear it.
The world of technology has made, I'll say output measurements. I would say output measurements so easy to get now that it's, when I first joined the NBA 10 years ago, ForceDex wasn't around. And so at the time, force plate metrics, you had to pull out on a spreadsheet. You had to make your own, graphs and everything. And it was just more cumbersome. It was doable, but more cumbersome. 5 years before I was in the NBA, that was the expense of it was just so much. Now it's so mainstream you can jump someone on a force plate and you can pull out their report instantaneously.
Yeah.
You have a million different ways to measure maximal isometric force. And what happens when you have all of that technology widely available to you is it skews your view of what your program needs to accomplish on any given day. I promise you this, no matter what we do in our weight room, there is nothing more powerful, more explosive, more elastic than what our players do on game day. And that's a cliche thing to say, but it's important to remember that there's always a cost to be paid for for improving, going output all the time. And there's something that needs to be offset there. And I believe this is core to my principle of what I talk to our staff about there's time for performance training and there's time for performance management. And in season, the art of it all is performance management. And if you can't have a performance management program with the goal or the intent of improving someone's output, because you have competing variables there. I have a more specific example than that if that's too abstract. So Brian Mann is a mentor of mine. He was my coach in college. I worked with him at Mizzou. I'm on the cover of his very first Tendo book.
Nice. I didn't know that. You're like a celebrity.
It's an old ebook, and and it's a picture of me lifting from behind. So it's just no one knows. But that's how long ago it was. So I'm fairly well versed in velocity-based training, and I believe in its approach, and I believe in the principles he preaches, and I believe it works. I believe that. There is a physical therapist named Ebony Rio and so she's
been on the show.
Yeah, so
great.
And she's a protege of Jill Cook.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing she will say, and she says this multiple times now, is if you really want to screw a tendon up, add load and speed to the mix, like loaded jumps. And so on one hand, you have Brian Mann, who has really good research on the improvements in performance outcomes when you add load and speed together. And on the other hand, you have someone who's done a lot of tendon research and talks about how you can really cause some issues by adding load and speed together.
Yeah.
And so what they're ultimately saying is there's a difference between training for output and performance and training to manage someone that's going through those things. And so obviously I don't want to speak for her, but like what she would say is she would do very low force producing things like long-term isometrics and really slow tempo lifting, things that we know if you did that exclusively would probably hurt your vertical jump in the end of the day. But because you're doing them in conjunction with your sport, it's something different. So that from my end, that's very telling that like you have to put on the hat you're hired to wear. And despite the fact that we love things like French contrast training methods and improving vertical jumps and improving RSIs in the course of an 82 game season, that's probably inappropriate. You're dealing with a classification of athletes that the risk highly outweighs the reward. And so you need to find different ways to evaluate what you're doing with players at this level. That's just what it is. Now there's certain cases where I will look at a player and I'll, decide, is physical development an issue that's going to keep you out of the NBA? Is that going to be the reason why your career gets cut short? In that case, the training changes and yet you take a little bit more risks because you want them to succeed. Those are few and far between, usually with younger teams, teams that maybe aren't as competitive. We've had that.
Yeah.
That's part of the life cycle of the NBA. But in those situations, I think you put on your developmental hat and you do things a little bit differently. Those are fewer and farther between in the NBA these days. Most of the players, when I say that, I think the tendency is to believe that if they're just weak, then that's what's going to keep them out. That's not true. There's a lot of people that are not great weight room performers that are exceptional basketball players.
Yes.
The difference is this going to limit your game on the court based on your style of play and what the team needs you to do? And if that's the answer, and the answer to that question is something you need insight from other stakeholders within the organization to answer, then that's different, and you go after it. But I don't think that's something the strength coach can answer by himself. I think that's, what's the vision for this player? Where are they short on this? What's going to get them out of the league? And you need insight from a lot of different areas of the organization to answer that.
Dude, oh my God, that was such a good answer. I had like 3 things that I was writing down there. Like number one of my pet peeves is when some random, just random jabroni looks at a basketball player and sees that somebody's thin and they're like, oh, well, they're just weak. Yeah. Versus, you put some of these guys on force plates. Yeah. Hey, maybe in a gym, like strength training environment where there's like a technical component and everything else, they don't look that strong. But hey, an isometric test, or you put them on a basketball court and people are like, I can't move that guy.
Yeah.
So there's that component of it. Another piece, you talk about outputs, and this is my other thing, is like we love to chase outputs. And so as a strength coach, what did we do initially? Well, we can test their squat, bench, and deadlift, or we can test their clean or their snatch, whatever. Those are easy to test. Well, now it's easy to test vertical jump or all these output-based metrics. You and I also know, hey, look, not everybody's going to be able to jump, 57 centimeters.
Yeah.
So what do you tell the young kid that just wants to like maybe play, Division I basketball or play college basketball? So one of the great things about this is I've tried to invert that whole thing and say, hey, look, we'll take your output as high as we can get it, right? And, I don't know how high that'll be, but we'll make efforts to do that. But hey, what if we focused on the other side of this coin? What if we focus more on breaking? What if we made you faster, stopping and starting, coming in and out of cuts? And so now this gives them maybe a different physical attribute that they haven't thought about as much, but we can still track.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's been fun for me. And I think one of the great things is, obviously like the P3 stuff, right, where they talk about Luka, obviously incredible skill, incredible vision, like all the things that he can do, but his breaking is off the charts, right? Or another guy like a Jalen Brunson, I don't know what his breaking's like, but you watch him play and a lot of guys can be like, oh, dude, he's not like super athletic, incredibly high skill. He plays off too. So like giving some of these younger athletes these different player comps, I think is fun because everybody can look at Ant Edwards and be like, oh my God, that guy's amazing. right? He's got a highlight dunk every night. But for the rest of us that are, mere mortals, who are some players we can look at and maybe try and emulate their game or their physical characteristics that are maybe more realistic for us? And so I think that's where some of this stuff can be fun.
No, yeah, I think that the other thing to think about with all this is when it comes to training for the purposes of the classic bigger, faster, stronger, improve some level of strength output, and then flight time or whatever it may be. There is downsides to a lot of things that keep people off the court. What I mean by that is stiffness. Like we know muscular stiffness is a superpower when it comes to jumping and running. Ankle stiffness of Usain Bolt or whatever it may be is ground contact time. And we know those things are true. We know if I want to improve someone's stiffness, I can do a maximal isometric hold and I can do some contrast jumping. What we tend to not talk about a whole lot in the performance world, and maybe I'm a physical therapist as well, so I kind of interact with the medical world, and that might form a little bit of these opinions, is that stiffness is also related to muscle strain, tendinopathy, and bone stress fractures. And so
right.
when you're feeding all these things into the system, you have to be very careful about kind of the bell curve of the effects you're creating.
Yes.
And understanding the risks and the payoffs, but also what comes along with that is a big part of the job in an 82 game season. I've always said, I've seen a lot of really what I consider, I respect them and they're very good coaches and they get humbled in an 82 game season because they're sometimes not, they're using the same principles they would use in an off season setting or something of that nature. And that's just really important to keep in mind. And I'd always, like I said, this is my 10th year, and I'll talk to our staff about what I believe to be the name of the game in the NBA. And for me, it's like you have to be willing to do really basic things over and over and over and over, and not get bored with programming basic things. Because it's it's a different performance management is just a different mindset than performance training, and you have to be able to put that hat on when you need to.
Yeah. Well, and you alluded to this as well, is finding this balance between all the stakeholders, right? Because everybody likes to believe they are like the buck stops with them, right? Because that's how we are as human beings. But like you said, over an 82 plus game season, hey man, are you, as a strength coach, are you interacting with the PT, the massage therapist, the medical staff, so you can keep tabs on how this player's feeling? Because the thing that we always come back to is we always think about what we're doing in the weight room, but it's very easy, unless you're somebody like yourself, right, where you're traveling with the team and you have this constant kind of vibe and feel as to what's going on. Hey man, body changes a lot, I would assume, over 7, 8, 9 months, right? It is not static, and it's not just focused on what you're doing in the weight room. There's a lot of other stuff outside of that, not just the games, but the other thing you talked about, I think you mentioned this in Joel's podcast, is you had a month last year where you traveled 10,000 miles.
Yeah.
That's mind-blowing, dude.
We have for one, I can't say how fortunate I am to work in the organization I work in. It's one of the things that drew me. I always say, I don't know if I would work for any other team in the NBA. We have really good leadership. We have a very connected group, from coaches to front office to medical to performance to scouting to media. There's rarely a moment. I would say we're 100% in our intention to be on the same page. Obviously, you can't be perfect, but the amount of input going into, and by the way, the players part of this is the problem.
right.
Of what the vision is for them and where the money needs to be spent, where the investment of time, energy, effort needs to be spent is really important. Sometimes that is the weight room. And a lot of times it's not. And there needs to be an understanding there. And you can't discount through all of those things when you're writing a program what you just talked about, which is the amount of stress aside from just court and weight room that's going on. the stress of a young 19-year-old playing in front of 18,000 people on national TV games, failing in front of those people, going to their phones and getting crushed on. So like, it's like,
Right.
you have to take those things into account on top of the flying, man. Like the just this the lack of sleep and the shift in the circadian rhythm from after that experience of playing in front of 19,000 people, going straight to a bus and getting on a plane and landing in the next city at 2:30 in the morning. And like, it's like it truly becomes how well can you manage the stresses they're under versus do you really want to be creating more more central nervous system stress, more like physical stress? So like there's a lot to take into account. There's things I did not respect that early in my time in the NBA. I've learned over time to really like value those things, and it's for sure a learning experience for people that haven't experienced those settings before.
Yeah, I love it, man. I always joke around, but strength coaches, we kind of get like labeled, oftentimes negatively. Oh, they're meatheads, whatever. I joke around. Hey, there's a lot of times we're the one sane person in that room. We're the one that can step back and be like, you've done what this week? All right, we're gonna, do a little fluff work, get you moving, get you loose, and we're gonna send you on your way.
That's funny.
Okay, so another topic that I would love to talk to you about, because I talked about this with Chris Chase, because he was the one that originally put me onto flywheels, and man, this has been probably one of the biggest shifts in my training, because again, a lot of the fascially driven athletes that we get, some are okay with weights, but if we're being honest, if they have a choice, most would do other stuff. And this I have found to be a really good intermediary, because I find a lot of my fascially driven athletes, they like the flywheel. It just feels natural. They're not tethered and locked into one position. And there's also this rhythm to the entire thing. So I would love to hear your thoughts on just flywheel training as a whole, maybe where it fits into your programming or how you guys are viewing and using it.
Yeah, well, I think for sure it's a strong tool for us. I've used a version of the flywheel now for almost my whole time. I think we got our first flywheel my first year in OKC, and
oh, wow.
there was definitely a learning curve there.
Yes.
I think my expectation when I first got it was I'm going to do flywheels and they're going to get on the force plate and their eccentric rate of force development is going to go through the roof. It was actually what I learned right away was I would use it for an off season, and guys were getting worse eccentrically. And what I learned, I've since learned, there is varieties of ways you can use that. And for me, it was I just didn't have a mastery of the basic physics of what was going on there. And that's why I was making that mistake. And so I went back and kind of read into it. You can picture it a number of different ways. Is the basic physics of braking are, and this is, flywheels are a braking system. So the basic physics of braking is that you have momentum, and in the classic sense, momentum is, if I jump off a box, the momentum is my mass and my velocity. And then in order for me to bring that mass and velocity to a stop, I need to have a braking impulse that is equal to that momentum. And that's a combination of how much force I'm going to produce over how much time I'm going to produce it. And so you can bring a car to a stop very quickly by crashing it into another car. That's an exceptional amount of force in a very short amount of time. Or you can have someone trying to just push against the front of the car until it eventually comes to a stop. And that might take a very long amount of time, but it's less amount of force, and you can equal that impulse. So what I was doing when I had a flywheel, the flywheel is angular momentum of the wheel, and your concentric phase gets it rolling, and then your eccentric phase has to equal that and make it come to a stop before you go again. And what I was doing to dampen people's eccentric force production without knowing it was allowing them to ride the wheel all the way down to the bottom of their squat. And what I was learning, what I was doing was, it's not a bad thing to do, but just for the purpose of what I was doing it for was inappropriate. And what I was teaching them to do was to buffer eccentric forces by allowing them to squat into deeper ranges, allowing more time to meet that momentum of the wheel. And so it's a good skill in season to know how to do is to anticipate forces.
Yes.
And allow, so the deeper the range you're going through, and this is a major tool you can use in performance management versus training, is that it's anti-stiffness. It's maybe not going to help your force production a whole lot, but it's going to give you movement options later on down the road when you actually need it. And so I was using it inappropriately. I was teaching them to dissipate and have very low force over more time. And when I tested them back on my force plate, surprise, surprise, I sucked at my job and it got worse. And I since learned, basically the opposite of that would be a good way to prioritize training and high braking force, is to get that wheel moving with a strong concentric action and then meeting that momentum as abruptly as possible. And what happens is, where it fits in is that it's less taxing from a force production standpoint than like an altitude drop, but it's much more. It requires much more braking force than like squatting heavy with full depth or anything. So you're kind of riding this middle ground between traditional weightlifting and jump training, which makes it very helpful in rehab cases. Makes it very helpful in priming players for games that are more fascially driven. You don't want them jumping up and down a ton, and you're kind of riding that intermediary. But yeah, there's definitely different ways to utilize it, and and now they have motors attached to them, which allow you to get even more of an overload, which is really intriguing. But what I learned the hard way of like just making people worse for a little bit.
Well, look, or maybe on the flip side, you actually made them better because you were teaching them to distribute forces, right? So what you lost in performance, you gained in health.
I was trying to do the whole time, man.
Dude, that you had it sorted. But like seriously, so like that's one of the things I think about. So like when I'll ramp people into this, because generally I'll give them a little bit of a time and we'll get like a training block in and then move into more of this type of stuff. That's exactly how we'll do it, right? We'll go through deeper ranges, more triple flexion, distribute forces across multiple joints. And then as we get closer, as we start ramping up, now, again, make it more focal, right? More really like harder stops and starts. But like you alluded to, the great thing about it is that you don't have to leave the ground. Yeah. And so I think it does a lot of good stuff for us.
There's a nervous system effect on this that I haven't really put my finger on. But one thing I noticed with flywheels is really interesting is if you have a injured joint, you'll create like artificial protective stiffness. And a good example is like ACL rehab. When you do a little drop, you're not going to express as much knee flexion as you would. You can't dissipate as much. So people with long-standing tendinopathies tend to have that. And on the flywheel, it's really interesting is that, let's say they have a left knee long-standing tendinopathy. They have a really hard time letting loose and yielding and allowing that wheel to pull them down on that left side. And so what happens is they yield more on their right side. Their left side uses a stiffness strategy, and it looks like it spins them to. It almost looks like they shift right, but really what it's doing is I'm using stiffness on one side and yielding on the other, and I'm like they almost spin in the wheel.
Interesting.
I have used it as a good strategy to get them to feel what it means to give, because a lot of people with long tendinopathies are naturally like when that wheel hits you, when that wheel creates tension on that strap. There's two ways you go about feeling that, and one of them is people will naturally give and let it and ride it down.
Yes.
Some people will actually do the opposite and push against it and almost try to stand up.
Yes.
And it halts it right away.
Yes.
And what those people do, the injured limb side or whatever it may be, they try to push against it on one side and give on the other, and it creates like a
torque.
Yeah. So it's a good teaching tool to teach people to give as opposed to push. So I've used it for that as well, and just it allows. I think people like don't possess the feel, whatever reason some neurologist will come up with as to why, but whatever it is, that protective stiffness, when they encounter a force imposed upon them, they will push against and back against it versus give with it and dissipate it. I think the flywheel does a good job of giving them a feel of that.
That's really interesting. And it's interesting you talk about this, because a couple years ago, I had 2 or 3 guys in the off season. One guy in particular, I mean, we're talking just raging patellar tendinopathy. I mean, this is something he dealt with for 6 years. And so we kind of started to introduce the flywheel stuff in the middle of the off season. So we'd made some progress, started to introduce that. And I hadn't thought about it like that before, because in some ways it's almost counterintuitive, right? Like Rio said, oh, well, fast, quickly loaded stuff would probably blow it up. But for some reason with that, it doesn't seem to quite as much.
Yeah.
And so I was trying to think, like, it doesn't totally make sense, but again, anecdotally, like I have people that have had this issue and maybe it's the stuff we did before, maybe it's something else that I'm unaware of, but like, whenever I get them to this point and we start doing this, they start to do better. So
I do think there's a nervous system feel of what it means to yield to, like what it means to yield when you encounter gravity, and that's just accelerated gravity. It's all it is.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I have no idea.
No, it makes sense. And you got to think the other thing too that you generally see in that like tendon whatever, the side that is affected, right? Now that I butchered that word like 5 times, that quad tends to be super like concentrically oriented, right? Like that quad's on all the time. It's hard to flex the knee. It's hard to get it to yield. So maybe that's part of it, right? Like you said, it's just training that muscle to yield again, and then just kind of like break that cycle to where it's not just like locked and turned on all the time.
Yeah, 100%. And that you're using words that are like Bill Hartman, Pat Davidson world of concentric and eccentric orientation. I think we're all saying the same things and just trying to make sense of it in our own language.
Yeah.
In that sense, like when you're locked concentrically oriented, you are expressing high levels of stiffness at all times.
Yes.
And an inability to become eccentrically oriented doesn't maximize your ability to dissipate force when needed. And I think that's where I find value in the flywheel. I've learned to I was just very naive when I first got it. I was like, I'll just throw guys on there and it's great.
Yeah.
And get better. And that's easy. And then it's like, not that easy.
It's not that easy. Okay. Something else I want to talk to you about. This actually came up. So I've got this like iFast Basketball Insiders where I do like presentations and I do Q&As and I'm trying to educate people on the way I train my basketball players, right? And so one of the questions that I got asked, and I thought this was interesting because it really made me think, this gal asked about training bigs, right? And you think about the evolution of the big, right? So like when I think of a big, I'm thinking of like Shaquille O'Neal, right? Huge, big, strong dude, basically runs block to block, back to the basket. I'm going to try and catch the ball, turn and dunk on you, right? Think about how many traditional bigs we have in the NBA now, right? Not many. Instead, now what do you have? You have a lot of these like really long, tall 7-footers, right? They'll come out, set screens, but man, they'll set screens and they're running to the rim. So I would love to know kind of how your thought process has changed on training bigs since you've been in the league. Because I don't know, 10 years, the NBA's changed a lot. Like 12 years ago, I had Roy Hibbert, right? And he was a traditional big. He's going to go post to post or key to key. He's not out there trying to put guys in a blender. He's not running and catching a lot of lobs. So I would just love to hear how your maybe training process has changed or evolved with bigs in the last 5 years.
My answer is not going to be good.
Oh, sad.
No, I will say of all the things that we've talked about, my training philosophies on, using flywheels, muscular elastic, I will say before any of that enters my mind when working with any of our players, when they enter our organization, there's 2 pieces of information I want to know about them. And neither of them really, to some degree, they're impacted by their position. But the first one is with the organizational stakeholders, what is their vision for this player and why are they walking into our organization? Because by the time I see them, there has been an astronomical amount of work behind the scenes that is like years.
For sure.
Of gathering. So there's a vision for this person as to what they are right now, what they can be. And not only that, but the second piece of information is the player has the exact same, they have the same information. And a lot of times it aligns and sometimes there's discrepancies. And you want to, before you design a program, that I probably want to know that first. And so I say that to say that what position they are rarely enters my mind. The the demands of their position are important for me to understand. But at the end of the day, the pieces of information I want to know is what their vision for themselves are, what the organization vision for them as a teammate are, and where do I fall in with that? Where can I provide value in that situation? So I don't think I've made a decision based on position. I think that's part of the reason why I've gone down the movement style route is because I've seen multiple bigs play the same position and have success in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
And, we've had, bigs come join our organization and the vision is one thing from them and they're a different part of their career and one thing from the organization. And like I said, a lot of times those align, but very rarely are they typecasted into I'm a 5, I'm a big, I do this type of thing.
Right.
We've had Steven Adams in our building, who's like a prototypical big.
Yeah.
We've had, other bigs that are not prototypical, but good rim protectors and things like. So we've had, a wide variety of guys at the same position that get their job done in very different ways. And so I think for me, for any coach, it's really important to understand what you're doing in the grand scheme of things to help that player.
Yeah. No, that's a great answer. And I guess it's been a while since I've been in an organization, so I haven't had to think like that. A lot of times when I get somebody, it's more of a, hey, what do you feel like you need to work on?
Yeah.
Here's some things that I'm seeing that I think will make you a better overall athlete or basketball player. But yeah, you're absolutely right. When they walk in your doors, upper management, they've got kind of a vision for this guy. The coach has a vision of the guy and the way, the team is going to play and how that athlete will fit into the team. So I would feel like maybe at some level it's kind of easier for you, right? Because they're kind of telling you like, hey, this is who this person is. This is what we need him to do. That would probably drive some of your programming, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the ultimate goal, man, is like the, improving metrics that I'm gathering in the weight room for the sake of improving them isn't really helpful for a lot of people. I'm very lucky to work for the people that I work for in the front office and our leadership of our medical and performance staff because they understand that. One of my favorite, we always do assessments on players, and it's kind of a wide ranging assessment.
Sure.
But then at the end of the day, that assessment information is only as good as how it helps. And so it's always like, how can I help you today, man? Like,
right. Yeah.
Because it's surprising after you gather all that information. It's like the expectation of a strength coach would be like, I want to get bigger. I want to get faster. I want to improve my vertical jump. And a lot of times, I'd say most of the time, that's not the answer I get. I'm like, how do you view our area helping you in your career? And sometimes it's like, look, I'm 29 years old. I want to play 4 more years in the league. I'm worried about my ankle and my knee. And that now I have to use all the assessment information to answer those questions for him versus what a typical, like athletic profile assessment might be. So I view our area as providing a service to the organization, and the person. And a lot of times these guys are just one stop in the course of the journey of their career. Yeah. And it's important to recognize that. And if they walk away with a little bit of education about themselves, then that's a win. And so that question went, I said it wasn't gonna be a good answer to the question.
No. That was helpful though. That was helpful.
Yeah. The position to me doesn't come up as often in that conversation as you might think. The role the team does, and that is related. So,
that makes sense. Okay. So follow up to that. If you had to give me a percentage, how many guys come to you with the goal of, I need to improve my performance, and we'll just put that in air quotes, whatever that means, versus I want to be healthy?
Oh, it's 95% healthy.
Yeah.
You'll get a lot of, I need to improve my performance in the draft process when I talk to players.
Right. Because
they're younger. Once they recognize what the stresses are that are associated with the NBA, is different. Now, like I said, there are players that legitimately need to physically develop if they're going to, and it's not always who you think it is, but they legitimately need to physically develop to play their position better for the team, which will ultimately keep them getting a paycheck in the NBA. That's a different story. But I was 95% of it is like, it's just not a output driven sport. So it's like,
yeah.
It's just a different thing. But most of the players, if you really ask them that question, you'll get very pointed answers on specific issues in their body that they need some help with.
Yes. Well, and that's the reason I asked. That's what I found as well. Right.
Yeah.
It's very rare. If it is, it's generally from a guy that is like on the fringe and trying to get or stay in, versus the person that's been there for a while. They're just like, hey, I know what it takes. I know what I need to be able to do. I know the boxes I need to check physically. But if I can't be healthy or on the court, that's a problem. Yeah. So that's interesting. And I'm glad you confirmed that. Okay. So a couple more, then I'll let you go. We both have children to pick up today. I know that. I want to talk about in-season training, right? Because I feel like this is an interesting topic. This is actually a topic that I'm working on creating a presentation for right now, because I've programmed for basically all levels in season, right? Not nearly as much as you have NBA, right? Much smaller sample size, but obviously
for in season, so
right. So there's a big difference between high school, college, pros, and the rhythm, right? The length of the season. So I would love to know, just big picture, what are your overall thoughts here, and maybe how does that change for you when you're going from, hey, we don't have a great team, we're playing 82 games and we're done, versus now you got a pretty loaded roster. So how does your mindset maybe shift, knowing, hey, it's probably not going to be 82 games. It could be 90. It could be closer to 100 games. How does that shift your thought process and your thinking?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I could go a number of different ways on this one. For one, the name of the game is consistency in the NBA. We preach it to our players. If they are consistent, their likelihood of succeeding physically is exceptionally high. And so when we design programming, it's more about designing routines that the player can be consistent with, that hits all the big rocks, than it is about anything else.
Yep.
And this looks different for every player, because every player prefers rhythms of their life that are a little bit different from one another. A good example is pregame. Some players want to prepare for a game differently than others, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, whatever it may be. And so you're there to help supplement that routine. I have not hopped on the post-game lifting train.
No, really? Okay, that's part of why I asked this.
Yeah. So the reason why I haven't is if I could pick a time of day that is the most inconsistent emotionally, most inconsistent focus, most inconsistent fatigue, I would choose after a game. There's two things psychosocially going on at that moment for them to really consistently do something that is taxing, requires focus, any sort of diligence whatsoever. So I've tried it. I have not liked it as much. Now, other coaches have success with it. That's great. This is just my opinion.
Yep.
I have better conversations. I have better quality. I have better, training outcomes as far as what we're trying to get done with them the next day at practice or the next morning at the hotel when they've decompressed, they've gotten all their social media stuff out of them. They've had a chance to digest the win or the loss from the night before. They've celebrated the win with the teammates. They've handled once you can compartmentalize those things. I just find that is a much more consistent approach to get the most consistent mindset from a player is to meet them on a practice day. I recognize that. I also think that the training we're doing is not as taxing as what people say it is.
For sure.
A lot of it is slower eccentric, slower eccentric loading of key tissues with just really good movement quality, submaximal loads. We're not hitting PRs and squatting the day after a game.
Right.
So in a lot of senses, I actually think it aids recovery. And so that's one of my opinions I've developed over the course of 10 years. And I've played with post-game lifting. I do think you can get away with it for short bursts of time. When you really need to, I think, we've had a period of time in our season where it was just like our schedule was so condensed that it didn't make sense to bring people in on practice days to do anything. But when you add up poor quality, poor focus, inconsistent, just emotional stability at times.
Yeah.
Over the course of 6 months and 82 games, that's your primary time you're loading. Then it adds up.
Yeah.
So what I've done with our players that has been successful is just choose pockets of time where I know there's going to be a very congested schedule, a lot of travel, whatever, and we'll do some post game lifting there just to get by and just get through those moments. But by far and away, I want the vast majority of their lifting to be on times where they are in a much more of a steady mindset, and that tends to be practice days. So that's one.
Yeah.
And what supplements that, we have what I consider to be one of the best performance science areas in all of professional sports, if not, definitely, maybe in the NBA, maybe I'm just very high on them. We have very good professionals in that area, and they really do a good job of quantifying all sorts of stressors and giving us an idea of when that strategy needs to shift to post game and when it needs we can go a little bit harder in the weight room. And so we try to identify pockets of time that are going to be very stressful, recognize those pockets of time are going to be, if they're 2 weeks, I want a period of time before that's equal to that I can kind of push the envelope a little bit in the weight room. That allows me to do post-game lifting through that and deload a little bit from us. So to me, it's all about managing the schedule, the routine of the player, finding where you want to get all those big rocks in, and then being as consistent as you possibly can in every sense of the word. And that to me is the secret of the in-season.
Yeah. Okay. So I have a follow-up to that. And I'm really interested because, I do feel like there's a lot of people that are pushing hey, lift post game, and everybody figures out what works best for them, their team, whatever, and that's fine. Do you know of anybody that either as a team or individually likes to lift pregame? Because, okay, here's why I ask this. I found a lot of my athletes, and I remember being a kid, right? First time I really start working out. Just crush myself in the gym. You obviously can't shoot, right? But you do that for a little bit, and you also don't just kill yourself in the gym, and you realize it makes almost no impact, right? Because you get accommodated to it. And so I feel like some of the athletes that I've worked with over the years actually like lifting pregame because they feel better, right? They feel looser, they feel primed, then they go on the court, and they don't have to do it afterwards. It's like one less thing they have to worry about. So just kicking that back to you, do you find or know of people that like to do that?
Yeah. We've had players, like I said, I like to cater towards whatever is going to keep them the most consistent. It definitely takes a certain mindset to do that.
Yeah.
If you're a heavily introspective shooter or something like that, if you have a bad night and you're going to revert back to what did I do? And it's probably not going to work.
Right.
At this level, most guys know what it is they want to do and don't do.
Right.
Well, and we've had players that want to lift on game days, and I'm supportive of that before the game. We've had players that want to lift after the game. I'm also supportive of that. I do tell them my opinion on it.
Yeah.
And it's kind of to me, I'm dealing with professionals. I don't have someone that dictates my schedule on a day-to-day basis. So I don't do that to them.
Right.
Now I have ideas that I would like for them to try, and we try it. If they like it, they stick with it. If they don't, then we go a different direction. But we've had players lift at all different times, and I have players. We've had players come through that would absolutely hate lifting before a game, and that would be more than they could ever imagine. And then we've had players that don't want to play a game unless they get squat a little bit or deadlift a little bit before the game. So we've had a wide ranging amount of you get. I don't want to do any arms before the game. Then I want to do just arms only before the game. I don't want to do any legs.
That's wild, dude.
You have all these preferences that you're a professional, and I'm here to maximize. I'm here to help you maximize yourself. I'm gonna I'm going to help you with that.
Yeah, I love it, man. Okay, one more question, and then we'll start to wrap this up. Where has your thought process evolved the most for you over the last 5 years? I realize that's a big question, man, but.
Well, where that question immediately takes me is it's not to training philosophy.
Okay.
So the way my role has changed in the last 5 years professionally. I mean, I'm taking this as a professional question.
Yeah, no, I love it.
I do much more, I'd say, supervision and oversight of multiple staff members. And then the last time we spoke, I was probably working with almost every player myself. I had one other assistant. At this point in time, I think we have almost 4 other strength coaches in our weight room.
Wow.
So my job is yes, I work with players, but it's less, and there's a lot more staff interaction. So one of the things that I've come to recognize over the last, I'm 41 now, over the last 5 years or so, this is my 19th year coaching, my 10th year with the organization. You start to think about the fact that the average lifespan for a strength coach in the NBA at a head role is about 3.7 years, something really small. I'm in year 10. You then think about, I'm almost 20 years into my career. I'm 41 years old. And where my biggest perspective shift has come is that I'm probably closer to the end of my career than the beginning.
Yeah.
And so when you're young and in the beginning of your career, the mindset is such, and maybe it's immaturity. Mine certainly was like this. I want to accumulate as much information for myself as I can. I want to be the best I can be. I want to read all the books. I want to go to all the courses. And you're very interested in learning for yourself. And what happens when you get older and you start being responsible for other staff members, and you have this recognition that the twilight years of my career are in front of me.
Yeah.
I start really watching staff members and seeing where they need to improve. And then my day-to-day, I would say that my day-to-day professional development is more geared around what our staff needs and what I see in them than what I want for myself. And I think that's a natural evolution of just leading a group. I think it's a natural evolution, but you start to think about what the legacy of your career will be. And almost always it's going to be in the people that you've mentored and the people that you've taught. Yeah. And so in the last 5 years, it's really hit me pretty hard.
Yeah, for sure.
More people. I'm 41. What does the end of my career start to look like? You start looking at that retirement account and you're like, okay, it's coming along. Okay.
Yeah.
And so you start to plan. It's less about climbing that mountain for yourself and more about what is my legacy going to be when I'm done with this, and what does that look like? And so for me, it's just looked more like, like spending more time thinking about others on staff than myself.
Yeah. Well, I didn't understand it when I was younger, mostly because I didn't have one. But like the concept of your coaching tree, right? And like the people that have come up from underneath you or that you have helped hopefully guide and mentor, hopefully in a positive way over the time that you've been around them. And that's real, right? Like, and there is definitely a sense of pride. You know, when I look back at people that have interned at our gym or people that have interned and then gone on and opened their own business or worked in pro sports, it's like there's a weird, I don't want to say it's self-satisfaction because you didn't do that for them. They obviously put in the work, but there is a sense of pride, right? Like you would like to think internally that you did something to help them move their career forward, and that, yes, they did all the work, but you hopefully just planted some of the seeds to help them grow into the coach that they've now become, you know?
Yeah. And that it's always good to see people that you love do great things and achieve what they want to achieve. And like that you start realizing, once there was a period of time in my life where I would tell you that I want nothing more than the job I have right now.
Right.
I'm here. Yeah. And now I'm like, okay, so now what's driving you? And then it's like, well, what's probably driving me is what I can help other people accomplish, not just as athletes, but like the staff that works with me, the staff that has worked with me. So that's where I've probably shifted my focus the most. Like in 5 years, my focus is kind of drastically shifted towards like staff development more so than staff development.
Yeah, I love it, man. Okay, last but not least, we got our lightning round. So a couple short questions here, and I'll let you get out of here, okay? Number one, what is life like when training camp hits?
Actually, for me, it slows down.
Really?
Yeah, September.
How's that possible?
Well, September. We're getting guys. We're getting guys rolling with. We got all this preseason testing to do. We got guys coming in. We're making sure they're orthopedically healthy for camp. And once camp hits, it's like you're kind of handing them to the coaches. We're there a lot. I mean, it's not a big deal, but like the weight room isn't as busy. Hopefully the treatment tables aren't as busy, and like you're kind of handing them off and passing the baton to now it's go time. And so strength coaches, our jobs heavy off season.
Yes.
And I spent a lot of August and September making sure that our players are prepared for training camp. And once it is, things actually slow down a little bit. So
I love it.
It's a little bit different than you think.
I love it. That's good. Okay, number two, kind of a random question, but I want to hear your answer on this. What is the craziest weather you've had in OKC? Because I've heard some crazy stories about the weather there, bro.
It's not like I'm from St. Louis, and I've had more tornadoes in St. Louis.
Okay.
And I also lived in Florida on the Panhandle in Pensacola, and we had some torrential downpours there. So I think the weather is like overrated here. Like I haven't had anything wild come through in 10 years.
No, just crazy twisters or anything like that.
No, they tend to go south and north of the city.
Okay.
So OKC is kind of in the middle ground. Not always, but like since I've been here, there really hasn't been much.
Okay. Well, that's fair. I always heard horror stories, so I was like, no way.
I was ready for it all.
Yeah.
I got a storm shelter in my garage right now that I've never used once. So
you're safe and ready if it ever happens, right? Okay. The betting line is 4.5. All right. You can take the over or the under. How many Instagram posts are we going to see out of you over the next 9 months?
On a post?
Yes.
Oh, under probably. I'm low key on social, man.
I know you are. I'm just waiting for it, man. I'm waiting for it.
I'm older. I'm less social media savvy. My social media is people are always whenever I'm on a podcast, I get all these requests. I'm like, they're gonna be so disappointed because my daughter is
picture of you and your kid like every 7 months.
Yeah.
I love it. I always joke around, dude. Like I post more now because I feel like I need to, being a business owner. But man, I'm secretly envious of you guys not having to post all the time. Like you have to feed the machine when you're in the private sector, but
I get it, and I understand all. Like I'm glad. I would not be good at that. I'm just not. I'm never thinking about posting anything, and so every once in a while I will. But like that's funny you asked that because that's true. Like everyone follows me and like expects like my
straight knowledge.
Professionals like Andrew Paul PT, and then all I get is like pictures of my daughter at school and stuff.
Bro, I thought you were going to talk about 4-foot elastics. Like that's what we want to hear, man. Come on, give the people what they want.
Turns out that's not a big part of my life. I just
talk about it on the internet. I love it. Okay, last but not least, what's next for Andrew Paul? I mean, preseason, right? Is that really like just the next big thing for you?
Preseason, enjoy the season. I think that's one of the things that I've learned is like I've ridden the roller coaster of the highs, the lows of the seasons.
Yeah.
And we're in a nice little phase of an organization that's going to be higher expectations, and I just want to enjoy that with our staff and work hard every day and just keep showing up daily to get the most menial tasks done. That's what's next, man.
Yeah, I love it. I love it, dude, and I love watching you guys play. I'm excited to see how you guys go this season. Obviously, great year last year, young, so it takes time to kind of figure out the playoffs and learn how to win in the playoffs. But man, I'm excited for you guys. So Andrew, dude, I know you have a ton going on. You're a very busy man. Thank you so much for your time. where can my listeners find out more about you, and where can you ignore them on social media?
My Instagram is Andrew Paul PT, all one word. Like I said, don't expect much, so I would not that you you reach out to me there. That's where they can find me. I actually try to LinkedIn. I've given up on. There's been thousands of messages on there that I don't even go through. So anyone on this has ever messaged me on LinkedIn, I've given up on that long ago. That's a full-time job.
Yeah.
But I do try to do my best on Instagram or something like that. So
I love it.
Yeah, that would be it.
Well, and if you're listening, I'll make sure I will link to Andrew's first show on here from 2018, so you can hear the evolution and both of the shows you did with Joel. So that should keep him entertained at least for a little while. Sound good?
Mike, thank you so much, man.
Dude, thank you, man. This was an amazing show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks. Go get your kids.